Well, welcome back. Due to popular demand, I'm going to continue the discussion of corruption that you'll find in the first video on this playlist. And one of the things I've been asked about is, what about governmental corruption? The way I talked about corruption in the previous video is really more of a general broad stroke. So I wanted to take in the remainder of this playlist to talk about governmental corruption and then also compare it to some forms of business corruption. And let me ask you a question when you think about this. What do you think was the first act of corruption, and who do you think was the first briber, and who was the first bribee? Well, there's been some recent archaeological evidence that suggests that the first act of corruption was perpetuated by a Neanderthal known as Thur. And Thur bribed his tribal chieftain, Dante, and the two of them worked together to undermine the authority of some of the regional tribal chieftains. No. It's a little bit of a joke, I'm trying here. So, actually, we don't really know what the first act of corruption is. I don't know that that's an answerable question. As far as I know, and I'm, borrowing some commentary from a particular article, and I'll put the link to the article down in the link. According to this article by Vito Tanzi, the first example of corruption that's been written down is in a book from India about 2,000 years ago. And of course, even Dante, about 8 centuries ago, describes that bribers belong in the absolute deepest parts of hell. Of course, then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why do we even pay attention to corruption at all now? Why do we talk about it more? So part of it stems from the end of centrally planned economies. It's known, and I'll probably talk about it in some later videos. For example, in the former Soviet Union, there was a tremendous amount of corruption. A lot of this stemmed with what we call blat networks, B-L-A-T. And blat networks in the Soviet Union had to do with not always so much very explicit forms of exchange for money for like a service or something like that, but it tended to be swapping of trading of privileges, trading of positions. So, for example, you might have a factory worker that does a little something extra, maybe gives some excess to somebody else in exchange for maybe better schooling. Or one government, I think Solzhenitsyn talks about it in the Gulag Archipelago, where members of the KGB were known to swap favors with engineers. So, they would get somebody out of prison in exchange for an engineer maybe building a summer vacation home for them, or allowing them to use free hotel rooms and all sorts of things like that. But I guess the point I'm making is, it wasn't exactly money for services or money for favors, but it tended to be services and favors, favors and favors, or services and services that were being swapped in a kind of an underground economy sort of way. So now that there's the end of the Cold War, all that stuff that was going on with these blat networks is now becoming more out in the open. There isn't a state government that is suppressing it per se. And again, another thing that has changed since the fall of the Soviet Union is that there's less reluctance to talk about corruption. So the former Soviet Union has fallen, and because that state isn't kind of watching everybody, now people feel a little bit more liberated to talk about corruption. And of course, the media, all over the world is becoming freer and freer as time goes on, particularly with the rise of the internet. It's easy to say, well, now there's a free press in Russia, so therefore they can talk about corruption where they couldn't before. But again, I think the media has an impact, but probably a greater impact for discussion and study of corruption overall is the rise of the internet. And imagine that you go to your favorite country and let's say you're shaken down by a police officer or something like that. Well, now you can talk about it on your Twitter account. You can talk about it on your Facebook. You can email people. There's so much digital media out there that is not censored by a government or a press per se that it makes talking about corruption easier than before, and people can comment on what you have to say. They can retweet, they can post a comment on a YouTube channel like this one, so make sure you comment down below. But I mean, I guess the point is you can talk about it so much more, not just because there's fewer governmental restrictions, but because the technology has facilitated it, and in some ways provided alternate avenues that maybe even a free media couldn't have provided previously. Another reason that we talk about corruption more is, there is more and more growth of free trade between countries that previously may have had little contact between each other. So countries that may not have those strong traditions of corruption are coming into more contact with countries that do have traditions of corruption. And so therefore we have to study corruption more than we did before. And just like there's more trade between countries that have different traditions of corruption, non-governmental organizations are becoming more and more widespread. And of course, they also publicize the problems associated with corruption. And of course, another reason that we talk about corruption more is because businesses are always looking at ways of enhancing their efficiency, whether that is through eliminating corruption or through engaging in corruption. Either way, now corporations are also seeing that there is a value in studying corruption. And this is particularly relevant with American companies. You can look at it as fortunate or unfortunate, but American companies, when they do business overseas, are not supposed to engage in corrupt activities. It's actually against the law for U.S. companies to do so. And because of that, it puts us at a competitive disadvantage for countries that accept that corruption exists overseas or in other countries, and therefore they can engage in those kinds of practices. In fact, certain countries also have it set up such that bribes are a tax-deductible expense. And so this does put American companies at somewhat of a disadvantage. So for that reason, for those reasons, corruption is now becoming more widely studied. Great. So in the next video, we're going to continue our discussion of corruption. We're going to include some definitions of corruption, very specific types of corruption, and as we get further and further down the playlist, we'll even talk about some of the benefits of corruption. So I hope you enjoyed this particular video and you watch the rest of the playlist. Make sure you subscribe. I guess it's down on this side. Give me a thumbs up. And if you want to post any comments down below, I will answer them. Thank you.